In this tutorial, I will talk about Sophie dynamic services, briefly explaining what they are, and then creating one example so that we can test it and make sure it works. Dynamic services are basically custom pieces of logic that can be added to Sophie in order to allow her to integrate with external services or maybe execute some complex business logic and possibly change the conversation flow based on it. Here's an example of how the system works. During conversation, a common tag might call a dynamic service. Inside the dynamic service, you may have some complex business logic which may call a external API to handle a process or get some external data. Then, with the response of this external API, you can then redirect to a different rule inside of Sophie knowledge base, and this rule can then use information gathered either by the API or the complex business logic. For this tutorial, I will attempt to integrate Sophie with a Bitcoin API so that I can ask her for the current value of Bitcoin in US dollars at any given time. So first of all, I need to find a well-documented Bitcoin API. It shouldn't take long. So here's an API that gives me the value of Bitcoin on all major currencies. We will only use US dollars, but this will do fine. This is the URL. Okay, can work with this. To create a dynamic service, we are going to need an app called Visage Modeler. It is a freeware, so you can download it for free. You might need to create an account though. I already have it downloaded, so I'm just going to open it. Once you have Visage Modeler open, the first thing you need to do is import the custom dynamic service attributes file. It will automatically configure the application for creating dynamic services. We can set it to override. Now we can finally start creating the dynamic service. The process is very straightforward. First of all, I'm going to remove this lane, which we'll not need. Then we start by defining an entry point for the dynamic service. Let's call it start. In this case, I'm going to need a HTTP request. So I'm going to drag this blue rectangle here, which we'll call Bitcoin value request. And since this is a simple dynamic service, we're only going to need now an endpoint, nothing more. So let's call it end. Now we just need to customize the parameters. In the green circle, or the beginning of the process, we define variables that we need to move from the client context to the local context of the dynamic service. In this case, we don't need anything from the client context. On the blue rectangle, we define the parameters of the HTTP request, such as method, credentials, URL, headers, data, and the variable that will store the response. In this case, the method is get. we won't be needing any network credentials, so we can leave username and password empty. The URL we can get from the documentation. In this case, we're not going to need authorization headers nor send any data to the API. We're just going to define a return variable for this request. Let's call it local Bitcoin value. As for the parameters of the end circle, we have two. We must define a rule to which the conversation flow is going to be redirected to, and also the export variables, which is locally created variables that we want to export back into the client's context. In this case, let's redirect to a rule called display Bitcoin value. And we want to export the variable we called local Bitcoin value. And we're going to give it a name inside the context, and it's going to be context Bitcoin value. And we separate it with a colon. Instead of displaying the entire response of the HTTP request, we want to display only the value in US dollars. If we take a closer look at the response of the API, we can see that it is a simple object with many parameters, one for each currency. The one we want is US dollars. So instead of using the entire object, let's get only this sub-object using the property USD. We can do this here easily just using a dot USD. Now you may want to go even further and get only the current 15-minute value. For that, we need to get the sub-object 15M. We can easily do this by using another dot 15M. So now we have just the value of the Bitcoin getting exported back to the context. Now we can save the file so that later we can edit it. Let's call it Visage Bitcoin. Let's also export to XPDL. This is the format imported by the Knowledge Manager. Okay, now we can close this. Now we can finally head into the Knowledge Manager and go to Integrations. Here we can add an integration, choose File. We go to where we exported to XPDL. Here we can find the diagram that we exported. Let's give it a name, Bitcoin value. Save it. Now we just need to publish it. Okay, now we can finally create rules to trigger the dynamic service and also to display the Bitcoin value. First, let's create one to trigger the dynamic service. Let's call it what is the current Bitcoin value. Let's tag it as dynamic service. This is just a naming convention that we like to use. Let's edit the label as the same thing. We can even create a category named dynamic service. And let's set it as suggestible. Now let's set an input, Bitcoin value, and an answer. In this case, it's going to be a command tag, integration command tag, which is going to call the Bitcoin value dynamic service. So here is the tag, we can add it and save. Let's create another rule to display the value. Let's also tag it as dynamic service. And let's call it display Bitcoin value. Let's set the label as the same. Let's not make it suggestible, because it should only be called by the dynamic service. We can set it as a command, and let's also put it in the dynamic service category. The question is going to be the one that we put in the dynamic service, which was display Bitcoin value. It's very important that this name matches the one that we put on the dynamic service. Now here we're gonna get a variable that we called context Bitcoin value. And now we can add it and save it. Now let's see our rules. Here they are. One to trigger the dynamic service, and one to show the Bitcoin value. Oh, I put the wrong category here. Let's change it. Okay, so now we can publish it. Success. Now we can test it. Log into the Shutter client. Okay, now we can ask for the Bitcoin value. Okay, and there you go. That is the Bitcoin value in US dollars. Let's ask it in a different way. And there you go. That concludes this tutorial. For more dynamic service advanced features and also a complete syntax guide, please refer to the complete documentation file. Here you can find a brief description of what it is, all the procedure that I presented in this video, and also a complete syntax guide about all the parameters of a dynamic service.